and it's rather demanding. It's not simply asking to do a certain amount, to learn for a certain number of hours and a certain number of pages, and then go to work and do whatever you have to do to support your family. It's asking you to establish a relationship with God and to have it permeate your whole life. It's balanced, but it's also organic. It's real, perhaps for the more functionally oriented person who basically wants to be involved with Judaism, but wants to live so-called normal life. Then this kind of balanced, organic approach might seem very demanding. It might be much more attractive to find a way of satisfying the Torah's requirements and its commandments while at the same time being a full participant in modern secular life. I'm not sure whether this is the meaning of the Torah in Derech Eretz, Torah with a worldly occupation. Frank? In the idea of Torah in Derech Eretz with a worldly occupation, you may be setting up a straw man to some extent. If the idea is that Torah is one thing and Derech Eretz worldly occupation is something else, so to speak, then it is wrong. This is not the true perspective of Torah in Derech Eretz. One can be fully accomplished as a secular scholar and very fully accomplished as a Torah Jew. And yet they remain two facets of the personality with very little integration. Theoretically, maybe the integration should be there, but it's often seriously lacking in the whole approach. Especially with people involved in the scientific pursuits, there are conflicts between their intellectual, worldly pursuits and Torah. They inhabit two different worlds and they have the attitude that, it doesn't bother me, I don't think about those questions, I just do what I have to do. This is my intellectual world and I'm going to turn it off, and now I'm going to the Torah world. But isn't that in some ways much more appealing, easier to do? I have my job, I'm a lawyer, whatever, and then at the end of the day I turn that off and I study Torah. Wouldn't that be more appealing and easier for some? Easier is not the same as more appealing. First of all, I think anyone who thinks about how things has to admit that to some extent that approach is a cop-out. The approach of just biographically in your life and having to compartmentalize. I am not capable of integrating and therefore I'll live two separate lives. I'll be schizophrenic, and as long as we keep each thing in its place and they don't conflict too much, I'll be happy. It has a certain superficial appeal. As a meaningful approach to life, to my mind, it's just totally repugnant. There is no question that Torah is the focus, the axis of one's whole life, including all one's occupations. And that's the absolute ideal from whatever perspective that one wants to come. Whether somebody is first coming to it or has been in it from birth, integration is a goal. It's an ideal. It's not something that people have accomplished to the ultimate degree. There are very few people who perhaps accomplish it to a reasonable degree. But it is certainly an ideal that can be represented to people and one that is very appealing. An ideal of integrating your entire life and focusing your entire life on the service of God, but in many different modalities, not losing any aspect of one's life or any aspect of one's personality, having it all, but having it all focused, having it all directed. It's exactly the antithesis of the straw man idea of the Torah Derech Eretz concept of having two completely separate, compartmentalized existences. Let me throw another element in here. What about integrating political occupations in Torah life? Many people who get interested in Judaism do so for some of the kinds of reasons that they've been interested in causes of other kinds, political, environmental, and so on. Certain involvement in political activities which are dedicated to setting up a certain kind of political order, guiding the world according to certain kinds of ideological principles, could potentially be an even greater conflict with a Torah-focused life. I think the very reverse. If anything, the concept of omnipresence indicates that our relationship to God exists in every single area. We have the Midrashic concept that God created the raw material, but we have to perfect society. So political involvement is not merely acceptable. To the contrary, we can influence so many lives. And according to the Jewish ethics in general, and particularly as delineated by the Lubavitcher Rebbe, a Jew has a moral responsibility to involve himself in the world arena. To go out, for example, and say, thou shalt not kill, and thou shalt not steal, which of course has many ramifications. It can be flagrant. It can mean depriving certain individuals of certain opportunities. The primary concept is that man's created in the image of God, and each individual must have the opportunity presented to him to be able to actualize himself and all its potentialities. This has all kinds of ramifications, ranging from emphasis on the 7 Noahide laws and going on to providing education with moral values. To seize on that point, that each individual has to be allowed to, not just allowed, it's imperative. There's a moral imperative to enable each individual, Jew or non-Jew, to actualize himself or herself to the ultimate. So let me raise an example, a question that is often asked about Orthodox Jews who live in South Africa. What are they doing about apartheid? If there's a moral imperative for every human being to be not only allowed but enabled to realize his or her individual capacity, certainly apartheid is viewed by the world at large as the antithesis of that. We can take other examples, but in other words, it occurs to me that the Judaism that many non-observant Jews grow up with, at least this is the claim that I hear from the Reform movement, is that it's founded on the prophetic tradition of Judaism, the prophetic tradition with its emphasis on social justice and relieving oppression. The question is, do the Jews who are primarily concerned with the biblical Torah Talmudic tradition really care about the prophetic tradition of social justice? There's no question that there's a Torah perspective in each of these areas in terms of political action, in terms of the environment. But the truth is that there are limited resources. You're in a hostile environment. That puts a great deal of constraint on the spectrum of activities that Jews can get involved with. Now, in America, there's perhaps much less of a problem, where Jews are relatively affluent and they are not as concerned as they were 20 or 30 years ago that a hostile world might turn against them. But these things have to be weighed very carefully. It's very easy to be glib and say, well, you know, we have to march, we have to protest, and do all these things without any thought as to the consequences. And in terms of the expenditure of effort, perhaps it is better placed in other areas. Those are both very real concerns which, unfortunately, people that are coming from the outside world who have been involved in this kind of activism do not balance very well. They do not give much credence to these kinds of concerns. They are very sensitive issues. The Jews are in it for the long haul. Aside from anything else, it would be very nice if we survive. We play a role in the whole eschatological history of the world. That's exactly what we're supposed to be. But to a great extent, historically, this has been through example rather than through direct intervention. The reason for that, to some extent, is perhaps this twofold idea. First of all, there's a limitation to the resources. And second of all, you're living in an alien environment. You can't thrust yourself on the outside world without worrying about the consequences. It's an interesting paradox that Jews were able to be directly influential on the outside world only after more or less abandoning their identity as Jews. In other words, the price for direct participation, whether or not it was to exact consciously as a price, was that direct intervention was possible, but at the expense of your identifiable Jewish heritage. So you could become a Judge Brandeis, for example, and you had a tremendous impact on social justice, but you were far from being in the heartland of Judaism while you're doing it, and you really couldn't be. Perhaps it was true in the past, but I think that the possibilities exist to a great extent within our own time. Perhaps modifying what you're saying, if someone would come to me with an impressive track record in psychology or ecology, or a spokesman for economical equality, and he would say to me, does this mean that now I have to make a complete transition in myself? I would say that when a Jew does something that enhances the significance of the Torah ethics in the broad community at large, then this is a sanctification of God's name, Kiddush Hashem, and it is basically a function of Torah ethic and the fulfillment of divine will. I want to clarify that we've said a lot of complex things here, but it's not because of intellectual concern that we want to delineate or categorize various issues. Rather, we feel a great sense of obligation to share the richness of our heritage with every single individual in this world in whatever manner possible. We feel a deep sense of tragedy due to the Holocaust and the many Jews who were destroyed. We also feel a deep sense of obligation to the incredible sacrifices that were made for the land of Israel. Similarly, we feel a deep sense of tragedy if any Jew is alienated from Judaism, being ideologically torn away because of intermarriage, or any of the decimating kinds of negative influences in the world. There's an incredible catalytic process of historical return to Judaism taking place, and all of us are obligated to do our utmost to see that it encompasses all Jews throughout the world. was to come to at least a provisional conclusion. The clear message of this dialogue, as I hear it, is that in the Hasidic tradition at least, it is possible and in fact desirable to integrate all the occupations of one's life, professional, creative, political, with one's commitment to Torah. Given that this is true, it certainly makes it easier and more exciting to contemplate and begin to pursue this return to Judaism that you just mentioned. On a personal note, I can say that this is certainly how I experienced the process of return. Not as Rabbi Metzger mentioned earlier, as any kind of amputation, God forbid, but rather as an enhancement and integration of all the meaningful parts of my life. Oh, this is a very interesting dialogue, and I'd just like to bring in my personal note after I concluded this idea of this dialogue. It's just very interesting that many people, it is a major question. That's why I did bring it out today, and I think it was so important to bring this out, that people feel that being Jewish and being in American society is just antithesis of one another. You just can't do both. It's just impossible to do both. Can I be accepted as a person, as a Jewish person, in my job, in my social sphere? And I think this is why we bring out this idea. It's very interesting that, and it's very paradoxical, I would probably use as a better word, that in America today, which we're the freest country, and a person's allowed to be anything that they want to be, and nevertheless, when it comes to Jewish identity, people feel they have to give up their Jewish identity in order that to be able to be a good American citizen, where American society is just very much the opposite, that they never forced anybody to give up anything that they had to mainstream to themselves. They had the freedom of religion, the freedom press. You can say what you want, you can worship what you want, you can do what you want, of course, in the confines of law, which, of course, Torah law anyway is in the confines of law, of civil law. And they're, like I say, so paradoxically, where they came from oppressed regimes in Europe, where people had to have a certain mode of life, and their Jewish people remain so strong in their identity. They come to America, to such a free land, and here they feel to give up the exact things where the Jewish people for hundreds of years, throughout hundreds of years of exile and oppression, stood fast against. Well, this is just an idea, the modern movement, that a person doesn't have to give up anything, doesn't have to give up his skiing, doesn't have to give up his tennis, doesn't have to give up their job, and they can be a Torah Jew and a good Jewish person, and then they'll make a fulfillment and a satisfaction in their own personal lives, that they could feel that they could be a good American citizen, a good human being, and materialism as they want that they have, their nice home and their car, and nevertheless to be a good Torah Jewish person also. Thank you very much. Shalom. Welcome to the Jewish View. My name is Rabbi Nachman Simon with the Delmar Chabad Center, and today's subject will be kosher. Everybody likes a good kosher hot dog or a kosher pickle, but what's really behind keeping kosher? What's really all the laws about it, besides all our delicatessen food that most people know about, a good kosher corned beef sandwich to get your mouth watering about it. But we're not going to talk about recipes right now in kosher cooking. We're going to be talking about how to keep kosher in your home and outside of it. But we're going to make this in a few parts, and today we're just going to tell the idea of how easy it is to keep kosher. Many people think it may be complicated. They've heard about two sets of dishes, meat and milk, that they've heard about different ideas about it. Maybe it's more expensive about kosher. Many objections people have out there, and we'd like to inform people of what really is keeping kosher and really how really easy it is for everybody to keep kosher. And we have a few essays from just the book, A Handbook for Kosher Living, Body and Soul, because we'd like to think of kosher as not only as, like I said, kind of cuisine of cooking, but it's really also an idea of healthy for the Jewish soul. So body and soul is good for both. And this essay is from Leah Letterman. And Leah Letterman, it says, is a freelance author. And they kept kosher a few years ago. And they're going to talk about their experience about how easy it was for them to keep kosher. And this is called Easing into Kashrus. 2 years ago, my family and I entered a new phase of our Jewishness. we began keeping kosher. This was not a quick or easy decision. In fact, it wasn't until it became clear to me that, as a Jewish woman, I could no longer live any other way that we made the commitment. I have reached the point where I could not reconcile certain contradictions in our lifestyle. My husband and I made a point of calling our daughter her Hebrew name. But we fasted on Yom Kippur and we ate matzah on Passover. But in my eyes, this display of our Jewish identity seemed empty without the integration of Yiddishkeit into our daily lives, which kashrus provides. Now, after 2 years of keeping kosher, I still cannot put into words how precious kosher living has become to me. Yet I derive a great sense of personal fulfillment and satisfaction from knowing that kosher is a part of my life. The sense of control I have gained from keeping kosher has spread into every area of my life. As a family, we have been drawn together more closely in indefinable ways, in ways which I can only attribute to the role kashrus, or kosher, plays in our lives. At this point, although my family and I cannot even imagine eating foods which were basic components of our diet 3 years ago, the transition still seems new. And in some ways, the transition is not yet over, for we are always learning and growing. As a relative newcomer to kashrus, I can identify with newcomers to the world of kosher living. The exhilaration, fears, and confusion are all fresh in my mind. I would like to share some advice and solutions in a way which I hope can encourage and assist others who wish to develop this aspect of their Jewishness more fully. There is no denying that in one way or another, kashrus maintains an important status in the soul of every Jew. And it is precisely the importance that kashrus plays in the life of a Jew which can make the transition to kashrus seem intimidating. In my case, the seeming myriad of intricate laws and differences in custom, the traditional stereotype of kosher food is bland and limited, the social pressures of business, family, and friends, all combine to create looming obstacles despite the urgency of my need to keep kosher. For some, these difficulties can seem just as overpowering as those facing Russian Jews who are hindered or prohibited from maintaining the lifestyle which as Jews is their birthright. With my husband and young daughter, I encountered and overcame these fears. We read books, had family conferences, and encouraged each other until the obstacles which had separated us from kosher life fell away one by one. Together we entered a world in which we found as much variety in culinary experience and social opportunities we had previously enjoyed, in some cases creating new opportunities not only for our cooking practices, but also for our social encounters. But getting started. Keeping kosher is a change in lifestyle, yet it is a positive change which does not have to happen overnight. Just as a woman who is expecting her first baby may have difficulty envisioning caring for her child when he is 10 years old, a newcomer to kashrus may feel overwhelmed when encountering a person who has kept kosher all her life. How can we transmit a day-to-day process through conversation when the only way to understand a lifestyle is to live it? Therefore, the best way a newcomer to kashrus can fully integrate it into her life is to ease into it. It is a good idea to practice keeping kosher for a while you actually kosher your home. Give away all your non-kosher foods. Please try to give them to non-Jewish friends, or you may end up feeling like a hypocrite. And practice eating kosher style on paper plates. Keep meat and dairy foods separate. During this practice period, you may choose to experiment with different levels of kashrus, buying only kosher meat or eating vegetarian foods, acquainting yourself with different types of kashrus supervision. Once you already begin to koshering your home, the transition in lifestyle will have been largely achieved. The final act of koshering appliances and making appropriate purchases will, at this point, be the culmination of your efforts. A momentous change in lifestyle will have been achieved slowly and sensibly. As you make the transition from non-kosher to a kosher diet, you will be pleased to learn of the availability of a wide variety of kosher foods, the flexibility possible within the structure of kosher. As a family, I think that our greatest fear about keeping kosher was that of losing our culinary identity. I myself grew up in the Southwest United States, which may have been the most non-kosher cuisine in the world. We enjoy cooking and eating a wide variety of foods, and with each new cookbook or inspiration I acquired, we went through periods of eating Indian food, Chinese food, gourmet, macrobiotic, Mexican, etc. Yet keeping kosher rather than limiting my cooking abilities expanded them. The first and most obvious challenge kashrus presented was how to continue to cook our old favorites, but keep them kosher. Through experimentation, substitution, and the advice of friends, I discovered that there was very little, if any,